Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of Amazon Tech 2022. I'm María Elena Gutiérrez, the Executive Director of Conservación Amazónica, ACCA, a Peruvian NGO whose mission is to integrate science, innovation, and people, communities, and governments to conserve the Andes Amazon, one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. It is a pleasure to speak with you today in our annual event, Amazon Tech. Amazon Tech is the platform that brings together innovators, regulators, and friends of the forest to assess the needs of the Amazon, as well as present the advance and challenge in science, technology, and innovation to support urgent decisions for the protection and sustainability of the Amazon. I would like to take this opportunity to give our thanks to Norad and the USAID Prevent Project for their support, without which we couldn't put together Amazon Tech this year. I'm really excited to have such an amazing group of world-renowned experts this afternoon, such as Miles Silman, who has monitored tree migration for almost 2 decades in Cosnipata, Cusco, Peru, where the Amazon meets the Andes. He will tell us about biodiversity and the ecosystem response to climate change, as well as fundamental processes such as carbon storage. Thank you, Miles. Also, we are honored to have Adrian Forsyth, an unparalleled expert with many decades, of research and experience working in the Amazon. Actually, he just came back from the Manu Biological Station in Peru just a few weeks ago, and one of the 3 biological stations that he founded in Peru. I would like to thank as well an amazing alliance that we have with the Servir Amazonia program, where NASA, USAID, CIAT from Colombia, Ecociencias from Ecuador, Imaflora from Brazil, and ACCA from Peru are working together and learning from each other. As Dan Irwin, the Servir Global Program Director, would say, observing from the sky to give solution to the earth. We really grateful about to be part of the Servir Amazonia program. And today, we will learn of new developments in satellite technology to monitor climate variables and tools that are helping to develop climate resilient agriculture and to forecast flooding, droughts, and forest fire in order to protect the Amazon. We will be updated with the recent NASA mission, JEDI. I don't know if this pronounced really well, but we will learn a lot about this to monitor the Amazon in 3D. Personally, I feel really lucky to be able to hear from these exceptional researchers from all these universities all together. The University of Arkansas, Brigham Young, Wake Forest, and Maryland. Go Terps. Happily, today, we are recording this session because this valuable information and knowledge should pass to the universities and research organizations in the Amazon countries, especially in this critical moment when the Amazon is being dramatically deforested and degraded. There are now some parts of the Amazon where carbon emissions are higher than capture, where the challenge that we face today are so great. Forest fire, infectious disease, zoonosis, drought, flood, and the climate change impacts are increasing. This challenge cross our limits and boundaries, affecting all, but connecting all. This is Amazon Tech, a platform to connect. I would like to start this session inviting our key partner who believes in co-creation to protect the Amazon. Einer tells us. Einer is the special envoy on climate and forest to the Norway Embassy in Peru. He's involved in business development, renewable energy, investment, climate change mitigation, and carbon asset management. He has managed funds for over $300 million and has over 15 years experience in different organizations. Thank you, Einer. Please join us.
Thank you, Maria Elena, and thank you very much for being invited to open this seminar or webinar. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this number 2 part of AmazonTech 2022, which addresses important topics related to our joint efforts to preserve the global rainforest in general and the Amazon rainforest in particular. Science and enhanced knowledge play important roles in this, and one may get a feeling that the time that remains to slow down climate change and the loss of biodiversity seem less year by year or month by month. In this regard, more knowledge about potential tipping points, how to monitor the factors that may contribute to these points is crucial. Such knowledge is also imperative in establishing the forces necessary to fight against the increasing amount of denial of scientific facts, all the disinformation, the polarization, and the plain lies that taint some of the public discourse in many areas today. As such, science and technology are key to provide the public with facts that can inform about the consequences we face if the deforestation continues unchecked, but also about the most viable measures to address these increasing challenges. With the time window available decreasing month by month, an event like this enables increased understanding of the challenges we're facing and the possible consequences, but also about the measures that can be taken to prevent the Amazon to, in the worst case, turn into a savanna. Local knowledge is crucial to find the best ways to address this. Hence, we also need to facilitate an exchange of the already acquired knowledge among indigenous peoples and local communities in this work. These challenges are on a global scale, but the responses to this need to be adapted to the local conditions. This is one of the reasons the Norwegian government 14 years ago established the Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative, NICFI. Without preserving the rainforests and halting the deforestation, we won't succeed in limiting the global warming to the desired 1.5 degrees Celsius. But this will also have the impact on people and livelihoods all over the planet. Without the ecosystems these forests represent, access to water, clean air, crops, wildlife, potential medicines, and all the other natural assets, all this will disappear, and the level of poor people on the planet will not be reduced. Hence, the secondary and tertiary effects of deforestation should also not be forgotten. Fighting against climate change is also a fight for better future for people all over the planet. I hope the series of events led by Conservación Amazónica as our highly valued partner here in Peru will provide a useful step in addressing our needs for more knowledge. As such, I wish you all a fruitful exchange today and also for the next event, and appreciate all your participation in this event and this afternoon. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Einer. For us, the support from Norad and NICFI, it's a key, and it's a must. As you said, there's no future without the Amazon. And now I would like to introduce my colleague, and friend John Beavers. John is the executive director of Amazon Conservation, our sister organization, is our alliance. He kindly accept to moderate this amazing session. Enrique Ortiz, our founder, he just arrived from Madre de Dios, the illegal gold mining area in Peru. And he will join us at the end of the session. So thank you, John. John has a master's degree from the University of Massachusetts.
Of the Center for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Wake Forest University. Miles has conducted research in the Western Amazon and the Andes for well over 20 years. His research focuses on biodiversity and ecosystem responses to climate change, in particular the effects of climate on the establishment of species ranges, as well as fundamental ecosystem processes such as carbon storage and nutrient cycle. So welcome, Miles. Appreciate you being here. Please turn on your microphone and take it away.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for having me, and Meg, thank you as well. It's a pleasure to be able to talk here. What I thought I'd do is I set the stage for us thinking about the Amazon. So I'll go talk a little bit about the Amazon as a system, its importance, get into a little bit of the geography, and then close with the discussion of tipping points in the future of the Amazon. So I want to start off back up in space. So this is looking down from the space shuttle using radar, and what you are looking at is the elevation map of the Amazon basin. So the high areas are white. You can see the Andes, the Brazilian and Guianan shields, and then the vast loads of sediments moving down from the Andes out towards the Atlantic Ocean. And all of the drainages pouring into that are the Amazon basin. I'm going to focus on the Western Amazon basin, and I want you to keep an eye on that sediment plume coming out of the Andes, and we'll start there on the Purus River. So this is on the border of Brazil and Peru, and I love this image because it could be anywhere in the Amazon, and it illustrates this vast sea of trees, a little bit of human disturbance. And what I want to point your attention to now are the clouds. So those clouds started off as water in the Atlantic Ocean. They were evaporated off the Atlantic. They were advected by the trades onto the Amazonian plain. The water fell out, and it was taken up through the roots of trees, or evaporated off the surfaces of the trees, formed new clouds, moved further into the Amazon, fell out. And by the time it gets to this part of the Amazon, or a little bit farther west, as we'll see in the next slide, it's been through or off a tree about 3 times on average. We turn around and look a little bit to the west. So this is taken from Los Amigos Biological Station, looking at the Andes. This is the uppermost point still of the Amazon basin. And it can focus our minds when we think about the diversity. So about 20% to a quarter of all species in the planet are in the Amazon. When we look in just this single scene, 1 out of every 9 bird species on the planet is within your field of view. When we think about the trees in this area, we would think about seeing 2,000 to 3,000 species of trees within our field of view, maybe more, bigger around than a wine bottle, not even counting the small ones. It's a vast area of wilderness, a place where, in these regions, where you can see the world with relatively little human disturbance. I put this slide in because it's important to remember there are more trees in the Amazon basin than there are stars in the Milky Way. And when we think about the fundamental processes of biodiversity, if we just take that taxon alone, so trees, and again, trees bigger around than a wine bottle, The rules say that we should get about 16,000 species of trees. Of those, we found about 11 or 12,000. And we have these vanishingly rare thousands of species out in the Amazon. Biodiversity's dark matter still waiting to be discovered. And these trees do things. So they sequester carbon, they transfer water from the deep water table up into the shallow water table so that their neighbors will have water, and then move that, as I said before, into the atmosphere. Another thing to remember is that the Amazon is a globally important ecosystem. So it is the place where one of the large centers of convection on the planet, a place where a lot of energy is moved into the atmosphere, and that this forms connections with other parts of the world so that what happens in the Amazon doesn't stay in the Amazon. And finally, when we think about the Amazon as a system, we'd be remiss not to think about the aquatic systems. It's a coupled hydroscape of the land and the water are linked together. The Amazon puts as much water into the Atlantic Ocean, into the world's oceans, as the next 7 largest rivers on Earth combined. And it has a spectacular biodiversity, one that we're still just scratching the surface of understanding both the ecology and the biodiversity of the rivers, again, from the high Andes out into the lower reaches of the Amazon. And it's an intact and functioning ecosystem. So there are still megafauna in the system. They perform functions that regulate the forest. And we will talk a lot about trees and forests today, but one of the things to remember is that without a jaguar like this one laying along the Manu River and what it does by consuming prey, if we were to take those animals out of a forest, we'd cease to have a forest functioning and we'd have a collection of trees. Well, non-human animals aren't the only thing that are in the forest. It's also home to people who are still in initial stages of contact or still living in isolation. So here are some chozas along the Rio Amigos in the upper Amazonian watershed. And this is a picture taken close to the original shot from the Peru Brazil border. And I love this because it was taken by the BBC as a picture of uncontacted peoples. But if you look closely, you'll see a metal pot, you'll see a machete. So these are people that are caught between two worlds. And when Einar was talking about social justice and what we owe people, these are some of the people that should focus our mind on this. The Amazon is under threat. When we think about the Amazon, if you don't work there, we look from the outside, we tend to think about timbering. We tend to think about cutting down trees and selling them in market. But there are other forces that are larger in the Amazon in terms of its conversion with important effects. So one of these that doesn't enter into most people's thinking is gold mining. So there's a gold rush in all of the Amazonian countries. Peru has a large example, but Brazil, Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, you name a country and it's there. And it turns out that it's all throughout the tropics. And what it does is it takes that forest that we saw and converts it into a wasteland. And in this case, you lose not only the carbon that's stored in the trees, but you lose the carbon in the soils. And in that first meter of soil in the Amazon, there's another forest's worth of carbon stored. And as you go down below that, there's another forest's worth of carbon stored in meters 2 through 4 and deeper. And that carbon is on the scale of tens of thousands of years old down towards the deep part. So you're starting to have a geological process of moving carbon into the atmosphere. But this is the big one. When we think about the Amazon, most of the conversion is coming from conversion to agricultural. Roads built in, you have deforestation for fields, and then you have fires. And fire is the pernicious companion of what's happening in the Amazon. So fires are lit to clear agricultural fields, they escape into the forest. And I wanted to show you this as one of my favorite pictures from a study. So it's from Brando et al. 2014, and it's their experiment is validated from space. And so on the left-hand side, you see forest that's burned every 1 year, middle every 3 years, and on the right-hand side, you see what the forest should look like. So what it says is that you can rapidly convert forest into a system that is other, with deep degradation. So what I want to do now is talk about change in Amazonia and talk about geography and talk about tipping points. And one of the things too is, we use one word to talk about a vast and varied landscape. So Amazonia is large. You could swallow Europe within the side of it. It has a bunch of different habitats. So here is a map of the Amazon biomes. You could see the central areas of forest, but they're flooded forest, savannas and cerrado around the southern parts. And now what I want to do to add to this geography is to add the geography of human disturbance. And what you can see, maybe we'll take that way, you can see the disturbances are not randomly distributed through the Amazon, but they're concentrated on the southern and particularly the southeastern part of the Amazon basin. And when we think about these, one of the laws of conservation biology is that if there's a road, disturbance will follow. And if we look at the road network through the Amazon, you can see that the construction of these roads follows or goes hand in hand with these economic activities. All right, so thinking more about the geography of what happens in the Amazon, one of the large things that varies across the Amazon basin is both the total precipitation, which was what you see on the left-hand side. So the dark blue are areas that are getting 3 or more meters of rain a year. And you see a rapid decrease in precipitation as you go to the south and to the southeast. And more important to plants is not just the amount of precipitation, but how long it's dry. And so what I have plotted in the right-hand panel is the length of the dry season in months. And where it is high rainfall, it is also very low variability throughout the year. And again, as you move south and southeast, you start to get longer and longer dry seasons. That'll become important. So what's happening in the Amazon? Well, one of the big questions that people are talking about is there a tipping point? Are we changing the system such that the Amazon can move from one state to another? And so what I have plotted here is modified from a paper by Stahl et al. 2016. And if you look along the bottom, this would be tree cover in percent, going from low tree cover to high tree cover. And then when we look along the vertical axis, we can think about it as representing how hard is it to be in a state. So if it's up high, it's hard to be there. If it's down low, it's easy to be there. And so if we go and look at a slice that's wet, we can see that it's very easy to be in a high tree cover state. It's very difficult to be in a low tree cover state. And if you were to move up here, it would probably roll back down to its most favored state, which is trees. And then as we get drier, we see that we enter into a place where there are two states where you could have trees and high tree cover, but another state where you could have low tree cover. And as it gets drier and drier, it becomes easier and easier for that system to tip or to favor the low tree state. And this can be caused by climate. So if we think about drought or thinking about climate change in the future, decreased precipitation, but also disruption of moisture flows. So we think about deforestation, land conversion. And the big one to keep in mind is land conversion and fire, particularly this link between agriculture and fire. And I talked about tipping points past. Megafauna and fire cause tipping points back in the Pleistocene and before. So what will we expect to see? Well, the top panel says how hard it is to be in a state. And if we look down below, what we would expect to see with tree cover is that there should be 2 peaks of tree cover. And so when we look, what I have plotted on the left-hand side, and again, this is from a Stahl paper, is just tree cover on the vertical axis, and then mean annual rainfall and mean average rainfall. And what you can see is that there's a state of high tree cover as you have high rainfall. And then as you go below 2,000 millimeters, between 2,000 and 1,000, that the forest or that the Amazon can be in 2 states. It can have high tree cover or it can have low tree cover. So there's a place where it's bistable. And when we think about the real causes, seasonality and also human land use are the things that drive it. So as you get more and more seasonal, you get areas that can have this bistability. One of the other things that's happening in the Amazon, and this is research, things that people have known about, but the real documentation has been recent, is going back to the story that I told about the clouds in the first image, is that we know that this water is recycled, and we know that that water then moves to other areas of the Amazon. So we break it up into squares. It moves from one cell to another, and that moisture becomes critical. So what does that mean? Well, here we can see those rivers of moisture that I was talking about. You can think about them as arteries. And if you start to get large amounts of deforestation, the forest doesn't transmit water from one area to the next. And downstream, you sever the arteries and you can dry the forest out. And this is just showing the most movement in places where there's very little movement from one cell to the other. The internal recycling of those cells becomes very important. So what's happening? Well, what's happening is we're getting feedbacks within the Amazon. So we can think about deforestation and fire, and that leads to large accumulated deforestation and degradation. So if we look at the Amazon as an average, it's 17% deforested. We add in degradation, it's more than that. But remember, the Amazon is a big place, and there are areas with much more deforestation. That leads to less evapotranspiration, less rainfall, increased seasonality, and increased drought. So what's the vulnerability of the Amazon to tipping points? Well, this is modeled data. And this again is from Wonderling in PNAS just this year. And the top panel shows the vulnerability to a tipping point. And what's striking thinking about the paleoecology is this looks very similar to what it looked like in the dry areas, dry times of the Pleistocene, is that in the south and particularly the southeast, you're predicted to lose the forest. But what's interesting is we can break that out to climate change due to drought and its vulnerability. And you see that's highly concentrated in the southeast. But then also when we think about this loss of moisture transport that I was talking about, that's concentrated in the southwest. So you can see the large effect of that, leading to the southern and southwestern Amazon having higher vulnerability. So what's happening now? Well, this is a study from Gotti et al. In 2021, and I want to just take you through it to close out the talk. So if we look at the arrows, the orange arrows are deforestation. The blue arrows are precipitation during the end of the southern hemisphere dry season, so August, September, October. And then the white is temperature, so thinking about anomalies in these two things. And then if we look at the numbers, the blue is the total carbon flux. So when we think about what the Amazon does with carbon, that's the number to look at. And then the green is the ecosystem flux, and the red is the fire flux. And what you can see is that on all of these sites, in the Amazon, the four corners, that there has been increased deforestation, decreased precipitation, and decreased dry season precipitation, and increased temperature anomaly. And what it's led to in every case is that the Amazon has become a net source of carbon going from a sink. And it's largely due to the effect of fire in releasing carbon. Ecosystems still working for us, trying to sequester carbon in all but the southeast. And but the fire has outmoded it. So what do I want you to take away from this talk? One, the Amazon is vast and has deep global importance. The basic functions are under threat in ways that have interacting and cascading effects. Deforest degradation and fire synergy is the largest threat now and in the near future, and it robs the forest of its natural resilience. Climate change predicted by 2100 can lead to climate-driven contractions similar to what we saw in the Pleistocene. Tipping points will be crossed, but they won't be crossed everywhere. They'll be focused in the southeast and southern Amazon and not in the north and central. Deforestation and economy can also drive regime changes. We often think about climate and climate change, and I think that tends to absolve us a little bit or distances us from the changes. Remember that North America was deforested with hand tools in 150 years due to economic changes and population growth. The same thing can happen in the Amazon. And finally, pertinent to today's session, the ability to monitor and predict changes in forest cover and climate are central to managing the Amazon and constraining future scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miles. What a great presentation about tipping points past and future. There's a lot to digest there. Now, I would like to get on to our next speaker, Laura Duncanson. Laura is an assistant professor of geographical sciences at the University of Maryland and is part of the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, part of the JEDI mission team at NASA. Her research is based largely on NASA Goddard's LIDAR technology efforts. She also sits on the science teams of NASA's Carbon Monitoring System and Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, and she's the project scientist for the bilateral European Space Agency and NASA multi-mission algorithm and analysis platform being developed for collaborative algorithm development and LIDAR SAR biomass mapping. She's also co-lead of the Committee for Earth Observing Satellites, the Working Group on Collaboration and Validation, Land Product Validation, and Biomass Protocol. So, Laura, thank you so much for being here with us. Please turn on your microphone and take it away.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be talking about remote sensing of forests in 3 dimensions, primarily from NASA's JEDI. And I'll touch on a few other upcoming exciting NASA missions as well. But the main take home is that JEDI is currently collecting 3D forest structure data from the International Space Station, and it is the first ever LiDAR system designed, like satellite LiDAR system designed specifically for forest structure. If you press play on this animation, this is an animation from Matt Hansen's group, also at the University of Maryland, and it shows what we've seen for decades. We've been watching the Amazon and the rest of Earth's forests from space with the Landsat series, and unfortunately, we do see this over-familiar pattern of forests disappearing, forest cover loss. And this is around a protected area in the Brazilian Amazon. And you can even start to see some intrusion inside this protected area in the late 2010s. So we see this, we see deforestation, we see forest loss, but to date, we haven't had a really good estimate of how much carbon is being lost with those deforestation activities. We have some estimates from some kind of old maps that were not really using the best possible satellite data because it didn't exist yet. So JEDI is the first data set that will really be able to quantify how much carbon is going to be lost from future deforestation. And hopefully this will improve our ability to monitor and better manage these systems. So go to the next slide, please. And if we play the animation, this is what JEDI actually collects. So if you want to play with some JEDI data, this is what it'll be looking like. JEDI is about a refrigerator-sized box plugged into the side of the International Space Station, and it has 3 lasers on it. Each of these lasers illuminates about a 25-meter diameter, kind of like a small forest plot on the surface. And it doesn't collect wall-to-wall data like Landsat. It collects billions and billions of LiDAR waveforms, which are essentially height and density measurements, so 3D measurements of the forest. Here you can see the laser beam coming in, and the first photons reflect back off the top of the canopy, and the last photons reflect off the ground. So this orange squiggle is what we call a waveform, and the top of the waveform minus the bottom of the waveform gives us the height of that forest. The area under that curve gives us the volume of that forest, and we translate these waveforms into sort of formal products that you can download and play with today, including products predicting the biomass or carbon of each individual shot. So there are over, I think, 13 billion of these around the world now, and all the data products are available freely online. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show you some of the products, a little bit of eye candy. So not only do we map forests, but we also map topography. So the elevation of the bottom of those waveforms, even under dense canopy, we get really good elevation maps. So this hopefully will help improve the mapping of the topography of the Amazon basin under those dense forest areas. Next slide, please. And then this is showing the JEDI canopy height map. So that's the top of the waveform minus the bottom. Again, you can see some of the taller trees in the Amazon highlighted there, as well as the other big basin, forested basins of the Earth. And then finally, on the next slide, we show biomass. So next slide, please. Sorry. All right, so this is our latest product. And this is where we've converted those waveforms into estimates of biomass and then mapped them spatially. This is at a 1 kilometer resolution. So as I said, it's not a wall-to-wall data set. We aggregate, we take all of those 25-meter shots within each 1 kilometer cell to make these wall-to-wall products. And even then, they still have some gaps because of the International Space Station orbit, but it's just way better data than we've ever had before, and it's going to get better and better through time. Next slide, please. So if you're starting to look at JEDI data, this is the spatial distribution. So if you download it and plot it on some mapping software you're used to, you'll see these circular footprints. These are 25 meters each, and they're spaced in this pattern where there's about 60 meters between 2 on the same orbit, and then 600 meters between 2 tracks. So this is kind of the way the data looks. To fill in those spatial gaps, we do a lot of data fusion with other missions that you are probably quite familiar with, such as Landsat and some upcoming SAR missions. Next slide, please. All right, so to actually translate those waveforms into estimates of carbon or above ground biomass, we have a paper out on the algorithms, which I won't get into the details of, but I did want to highlight that this has really been a big international effort. So we can never directly map biomass or forest carbon from space. We have to translate something we can map, like height or volume into estimates of biomass. So essentially we develop our own allometries. So we've partnered with researchers all over the world who've gone into the woods, actually measured trees with DBH tapes, etc., and have estimates of field biomass that also have airborne LiDAR that corresponds with those field collections. So there are several of those around the Amazon, and there's more and more collections going on. So we're pulling this data in, building our empirical biomass models, and they get better and better as we have more and more data. So if you do have any field and airborne LiDAR data, you're more than welcome to partner with us on improving these algorithms, and especially in some of the places where you might see some big data gaps on this map. Next slide, please. And this is just a link to, or screenshots of where you can get the data. So you can use NASA Earth Data Search, but the JEDI products are split between two different DACs, the LP DAC and the ORNL DAC, depending on the product level. So all of the data, just like all NASA data, is free, publicly available, and we're hoping that as many people as possible can use it so that we can advance science. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in just doing, you don't want to download any data, you just want to look at it, for the biomass maps, we've put them into, don't know what's going on with the presentation, but we've put them into a web dashboard. So I think it's on the next, a few slides forward from here. There's a website, and you can go and you can explore the products. And this is not just the NASA products, but it's other products from NASA's ISAT-2 and the European Space Agency's CCI, biomass, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, and there's an animation on here. You might have heard that JEDI is supposed to come off the space station early next year. So this is in February, just in a few months. And this is not because there's anything wrong with the mission. The lasers are operating very, very well. But because we're up on the space station, not on our own satellite, it means we're essentially renting space there rather than having bought our own satellite. And so the JEDI lease is up. And we find this to be quite a scientific tragedy because this is an amazingly unique data set. And we're just starting to unpack some of the science answers we can only ask with 3D structure at a global scale. But we're out of time on the space station. So we've been lobbying to NASA and to others to try and keep JEDI up and save JEDI. And it does look like there's a potential to keep it on the space station for longer. We are forecasting that the lasers could be good until 2030. So that would really give us a great time series to start to look beyond 3D stock maps to 3D change. So stay tuned and please add your voice to this petition. Next slide, please. I think I only have two more. And the first last point is that JEDI is only one of a whole suite of really exciting new missions that are going to be available. So there's also ISAT-2 that is it's obviously optimized for the ice community, not for forests. But there's also some really exciting radar missions. So we have NASA ISRO's NISAR, which is an L-band SAR, which does wall-to-wall mapping, can see through clouds. It doesn't give you the height like that JEDI gives you, but if you calibrate it with JEDI, then you can make height and biomass maps, etc. There's also the European Space Agency launching a P-band SAR mission called Biomass, and those are being launched in 2023 and 2024. So those are really soon, and hopefully we can keep JEDI up, and then we can do really amazing LiDAR SAR fusion. Next slide, please. Which is my last. So this is where I think the future of remote sensing of forest structure is going, is really this LiDAR SAR combination. So you get these incredible 3D samples with the LiDAR missions such as JEDI, and then you'll be able to map those continuously through space and time with NISAR and biomass and others. So I think this will be really exciting, particularly for cloudy places like tropical forests in the Amazon, to give us better, higher resolution maps that are gap and cloud free. Next slide, please. I think that this is just my thank you. Yes, so please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions about JEDI. And thanks so much for your attention today.
Well, thanks so much, Laura, for providing such interesting presentation of the NASA JEDI mission and future missions. Pretty amazing stuff. For our next speaker, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Catherine Nakalembe. She's an assistant research professor at the University of Maryland and the NASA Harvest Africa Program Director and member of the NASA Severe Applied Sciences team. She also serves as the Agriculture and Food Security Thematic Lead there. She's a 2020 Africa Food Prize laureate that was awarded to her for her dedication to improving the lives of smallholder farmers through satellite technology that harnesses data to guide agricultural decision-making and help prevent potentially disastrous impacts of crop failure. So it's great to have you with us, Catherine, and please take it away, turn on your microphone, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here today. I'm going to share a little bit about how agriculture is monitored with Earth observations and machine learning. I'll give a lot of examples from Africa, but a key point is that the tools and the technology can be accessed and used globally. And so it's very much applicable to agriculture systems in the Amazon region, as well as the fact that this intersection between forest loss, agriculture expansion is really critical to monitor and understand, because improving agriculture productivity is potentially one of the ways that we could save a huge chunk of forests globally. And so I'm going to take it away. So the background, of course, is the fact that we have these satellite missions that have been observing our Earth, for over, since the 1970s. And this has been really critical for making sure that, we can detect, track, and monitor things over time, over really large areas. We have an explosion in terms of data sets. There's just a few of some of the ones that are available. The work that Laura just shared about, I've seen some research that has been integrating LiDAR data for looking at crop type in very complex systems in very smallholder agriculture. And this is really incredible. We're also in this era in terms of an explosion in satellite missions, high resolution data, commercial providers, and computation capability. So with cloud computing, we're able to process a lot of data over really large areas, track things really, really rapidly. And with a huge interest from the machine learning community and integration of using deep learning approaches, among other things, has made it really possible to look at landscapes that we potentially we're not able to look at in as much detail, as well as identifying and showing gaps that exist in data sets, including data sets in smallholder agriculture, for example, in the top right, that is a very complicated landscape to monitor, but this is where a lot of my emphasis is, but as well as tracking changes in very large agricultural systems and tracking them in near real time. This has been really incredible. So a lot of what I will share is that this intersection of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and agriculture monitoring for food security, and utilizing remote sensing agriculture. And so I'll show some examples of how all of this comes together. So with that combination, we can look at extracting information on croplands, so where croplands are. We can look at where crop types are. So besides just knowing that croplands might be expanding, what crops are expanding where, we can extract information for looking at things like field boundaries. Field boundaries are critical for if you want to understand area estimation, if you want to understand yield and productivity, you want to be able to have access to this type of information. We can look at things like disease. There's a huge interest in utilizing Earth observations as well as field level data to understand the spread of disease within crop fields, as well as from a spatial extent, in the sense that one part of a field might be affected by a certain disease that could spread all the way to the end. But if you found out really early, you could potentially devise ways of addressing that before it spreads to a larger part of your field. Other things include yield estimation. Going towards production estimates is really critical. So utilizing data like that can be really important to show what areas are performing how and what sorts of inputs can be brought to other areas where productivity might be really low. And so this is sort of like the overarching framework for the things that I've sort of talked about, combining satellite with machine learning, utilizing existing historical data with ground data to be able to provide information on what crops are growing where and how they are growing. So in terms of the work that I focus on, we try to improve the systems in which you can find these data sets and utilize them in a very simple way. The second is improving the methods that underpin those data sets. So if you're looking at a cropland or crop type map, When is it from? What's the resolution? And how good is it for the landscape you're looking at? And then I work a lot in developing capacity and making sure organizations that should be doing the monitoring and evaluation have access to these tools. And then, of course, developing partnerships, because one organization can't do everything. And so just to zoom into like one crop, if we know where, for example, corn is growing, we can understand conditions for that specific area, and data sets are available at a global scale. So if we're looking at crop conditions, for example, by looking at the normalized difference vegetation index, you can access information on what those conditions are anywhere in the world, utilizing, for example, the GLAM system on the top right. You can look at rainfall, temperature, soil moisture using, for example, the early warning explorer on the bottom right. And the data are global in the sense that you can utilize the same data, so basically use the same eyes and understand where droughts might be occurring, as is shown in this map. The parts of the world that are in red, or brownish red areas that might be experiencing a drought at that point. But when you combine that, you can understand that, yes, even though we might have specific crops growing across the world, there's an example for corn and areas that are growing corn and area under corn. And then the bottom right is showing production. So just because we're growing it does not mean that it is as productive as it could be. And this is where we can, there are opportunities to address some of those challenges around increasing productivity within currently grown cultivated areas. So combining all of that together, then we can start to look at tracking risks like droughts and how those might impact on food availability, food access by combining different satellite data sets. And some of the work that we are doing is making it possible for organizations to utilize these data sets by developing systems and processes for analyzing them. For example, this open map flow, where you can utilize existing satellite data with ground data to derive information on cropland and crop type. Some of the results coming from this is we have various maps developed globally, and these are some examples from Africa. We work a lot on ground data collection, critical for developing any of the products that you might get from satellite data for agriculture. So methods around improving this and making it really quick and accessible, as well as high quality and scalable in terms of cost as well. We work a lot on yield monitoring. This model that I'm showing has been tested in many, many areas, including in Argentina, in the Ukraine, and it's been working pretty well and comparable to other yield models. We do a lot of capacity building. So in order to make these tools worthwhile and useful for decision making, we have to make sure that people who make those decisions have access to information. And this is done through training analysts who work in ministries of agriculture, among others. Partnerships, as I mentioned, it's not possible for one organization to do all of this. So we work across different partners, be it through data access or ground data collection. All of this sort of comes together to leverage and make sure that we have the best available information. In terms of impact of the work that we've done, developing these bulletins across multiple countries that are utilizing them. This is an example of what the Kenya one looks like on the inside. It's developed by the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya. We have many more in other countries. Data from the GLAM system that I showed at the beginning has been utilized for this disaster risk financing program that has saved the Ugandan government over $11 million in a 5-year period due to early warning. Utilizing this information for yield monitoring, for market information. This is from the Global Agriculture Monitoring system in combination with this yield modeling framework that we've developed. It's been utilized for allocating funds for COVID response in Togo, among other different use cases. And this is my last slide, just to thank you. And a few links to a couple of articles about the work that we are doing that might be of interest. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Catherine. That was a great presentation. For our next speaker, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Jim Nelson of Brigham Young University. He's a pioneer in developing digital modeling and informatics tools to help engineers and forecasters better simulate hydrological processes. His research has resulted in the development of water modeling software used by hundreds of organizations globally. He's also been awarded multiple fellowships and awards for his contributions to both teaching, scholarship, and technology transfer. We're glad to have you with us, Jim, and please turn on your microphone and take it away.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure and honor to be here today and to share a little bit of information about improving flood warning in the Amazon. And it's an honor to be amongst so many esteemed colleagues and the work that's being done there. And hopefully what we're able to do is contributing to that. So I'd like to acknowledge, recognize many others that are part of this work, including many students, other organizations and colleagues in Severe Amazonia, in the GEO community that have come together. No real good effort is done without a community, and certainly that's part of what we've been involved in this system. Next slide. It's well documented, and we've heard already today in multiple presentations the problems that are arising from drought and the lack of water. And but also, next slide. Floods are also a huge problem, one of the most recurrent and costly natural disasters around the world, and that also impact the Amazon and the productivity and the survivability of the people and the economies in that area. Next slide. So we speak of having water security. Water security is an important element, and what we mean by that is sufficient water quantity and quality for livelihoods and ecosystem and production, along with acceptable water-related risks to people, environments, and economics. We know if we live by water, we have associated risks, and we have to be able to manage that. We can't eliminate all of them. And so that's an important element and part of water security. And being aware and being able to manage that is a critical component. Next slide. We can also see from the Sustainable Development Goals that try to help us move towards greater equity and sustainability in different areas, that water is directly or indirectly a part of many of those Sustainable Development Goals. And so information that it can lead to important decisions and the ability to make decisions is absolutely critical. And that's part of what the programs that we've seen, the space opportunities, and combining them with other local information become very important. Next slide. So an effort that I've been involved in is the GeoGLOS, or the Group on Earth Observations Global Water Sustainability Effort. And our goal is to connect people with global water information, the kind of information that is useful for making decisions. Next slide. So an important part of that is hydrologic modeling. It's an uncertain science, but a critical one that allows us next to first understand, next slide, patterns, trends, and changes, next, so that we can predict where, when, and how much water we have, next. And all of that leads to identifying problems, making plans, and then responding to them. Next slide. So really, it's difficult in order to be able to combine many global data sets, and information requires digital elevation, digital land use, global meteorological forecasts. And so for many years, these kinds of things, we've had to download all of that information and then process and run it locally. And it requires each organization that needs that kind of data to make this information for decision making, to process, to calibrate, and run it on their own. What we've been trying to do through the GeoGLOS effort is to move things upstream a little bit so that we can access and use that data and information on the cloud and leverage global cyber infrastructure and expertise so that we can provide services to deliver that information for decision makers. Next slide. This has led to the GeoGLOS ECMWF Streamflow Services. It's a global hydrologic model derived from satellite and other global data sets. It is a service that provides a map that displays the water situation on every river of the world, as well as 2 data services, 40-year retrospective analysis and a daily 15-day ensemble forecast on every river of the world. These services can be combined in different ways for users. Next slide. What it means is that individuals for their river specifically can use a REST URL or REST API and a URL to access their specific data and then use it in the way that they need to. There's many other functions that allow you to get the historical data, warning points, other services that are provided from that global hydrologic model. Next slide. This shows the global hydrologic viewer, where you can see the rivers here, the colors, and represent extreme events or the possibility of extreme events, and the thickness, the magnitude of flow in the rivers. As you can also access the data service. So here you're seeing the forecast as it's accessed. It's an ensemble forecast. So that means there are 50 different possible perturbations and then the statistics associated with them, so that uncertainty is conveyed and then can be used in making the decision. Next. Because it's a service, it can also be customized for local use. And this shows the countries that we're working with in the Amazon basin in order to bring these services for their use. And the points represented in red identify locations where they're bringing together their local observations in order to improve the forecast. Next slide. So that's an important element that we want to be able to improve these models guided by local data and local information. And here you can see how that's being done across the Amazon region and the countries associated with it. Next. It's also important to be able to provide adequate training, help people understand how to deal with the uncertainty associated with the hydrologic forecast so that they can make the best decisions possible. Next. These tools are being developed for different countries, not only the streamflow tool, but also information to process gridded time series data to extract for other kinds of modeling purposes, also satellite flood maps that can be used to both monitor floods, but also through machine learning and other techniques to help predict floods. And the management of local water observation data that can be combined with satellite data to improve it. Next. Working with Amazon Web Services, we are preparing to have an initiative that will allow these kinds of tools to be published and maintained and managed by different organizations, in this case, hydrometeorological services in the region. These applications that are used for decision making can be stored in the same way we have in mobile app store. We can share them so that these technologies can be useful across other regions with similar needs. Next slide. I want to thank you again for this opportunity and for my colleagues and those that have supported it. And we hope to be able to improve the flood forecasting and water information services across the Amazon.
Thank you, Jim. A great presentation, amazing the coverage of that tool for countries in the region. Our final speaker this afternoon is Katia Fernandez. She's an assistant professor of geosciences at the University of Arkansas, where she leads studies on how climate change and weather variability impacts tropical ecosystems, including the effects of droughts on fire activity in the Amazon and in Indonesia on forest biomes. She has over 15 years of research on climate variability and change that has been very useful for societal and environmental applications. And she's an experienced writer and communicator of science for both the scientific community and general public. So thank you, Katia, for being here. Please turn on your microphone and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's see if I can see my presentation. All right. So I'll speak a little bit on the fire theme in the Amazon. I'll just have a timer here. And next slide, please. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that, and it was mentioned before, fires are not natural of the Amazon ecosystem. They result from human activities. And one thing that we have done in terms of research in the last 20, 30 years is try to understand its dynamics better, monitor it better. And one thing that I wanted to start with is with this image of active fires. This is a product from the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research. And I wanted to mention that one in particular because it's not something new. It's been operational since 1987. And what is new, what we are recently innovating, next slide, please, is combining that information, hotspots, for example, detected from satellites, with further information on the ground, land cover, for example. This is the project led by our colleague in Servir Amazonia, Douglas Morton, in which you can combine hotspots with the land cover and try to identify where fires are occurring and the type of fires. And that for decision making is really important, determining where sometimes limited resources could be prioritized. Forest fire, agricultural fire, understory fire. So it's innovative in that regard, and it's really useful for decision making. Next slide, please. And this is another example of the same project, only looking at statistics of fire occurrence in a certain location, and that can help understand what type of fires are occurring in most commonly. And in this example, they are coded according to the land cover. Next slide, please. And it is also relevant to mention that the technology for monitoring fires and activities on the ground are improving every day. We can have an image like a planet that I took actually from the colleagues from ACCA, from one blog that they mentioned this image. You can see very clearly where fires are occurring. We have the location, and with that type of information, the nature of that fire, if it's legal burning, agricultural burning, or illegal deforestation, that can be easily determined. Next slide, please. So that I mentioned so far mostly concentrates in the monitoring and on how we can with very high resolution monitor where fires may be occurring. The other aspect of it is predicting it using climate information. So fires, ignition of fires have a human component. The variability from one year to the next has a lot to do with the climate. And one way of doing that is understanding what drives fires in the Amazon. In this example, this is a statistical model looking at where one should expect a more active fire season related to the anomalies in climate that we should expect. Next slide. This is also a product similar in nature that uses sea surface temperature anomalies, which drives droughts in the Amazon, using that indicator to have an idea, to have an outlook in a couple of months ahead of time, what to expect in terms of anomalies in fires in the region. And this is also relevant for decision-making. Those who are preparing where to concentrate efforts to prevent and combat fires have an idea where more intense fires should be expected ahead of time, a couple of months. Next slide. The monitoring of fires tend to be very high spatial resolution, satellite based, and climate analysis is oftentimes less, lower resolution, spatial resolution. Next slide. And it is a challenge to combine these two different collections of information. And this is a plot showing the frequency of some of the data sets that we can rely on for fire monitoring prediction and how they differ in terms of frequency of availability, spatial resolution. So for example, deforestation alerts, you can find information perhaps daily or every week, whereas land cover information, it's still normally to find new data on that once a year. And if you go towards the climate information might be available once a month, and the resolution, spatial resolution, is much more coarse than satellite, some of the land cover satellite resolution. Combining these two collections is a very complicated process. And my last slide, please. Next one. And one thing that was mentioned by several of my colleagues, cloud computing and online platforms can help us finally combine those different in nature data sets and information in advance the research and applications of different aspects of fires, and provide decision makers with better information to combat again and to prevent some of the large fires in the Amazon. And I think that's my last contribution. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Katya. That was a great presentation and some sobering information there about fires. So everyone, we are going to have about 14 or 15 minutes of questions coming in from the audience. And I'm going to start off. Please, if you still have questions or thoughts, please keep sending them in to us. But I'll start off with the ones that have come in to date. There's some hard questions here. So Miles, I'm going to throw you the hard question. A question coming in about, could you give a little more, paint a little more what you think these impacts of the tipping point may be for the Amazon and for people in the Amazon as things move forward? What's it looking like in terms of the future? And what's your sense of kind of the rate of how quickly these changes are actually taking place?
Yeah, I tend to be skeptical by nature. And so I always didn't want to believe that these things were true. And what you can see is that they are happening and the pace is going to accelerate. And you should never underestimate the human ability to cut down forests. And you know, in the last talk, what Katya showed and what Amazon Conservation shows, the pace and the extent of fires in the Amazon are growing, and it doesn't seem like it's going to stop anytime soon, and the world is not going to need any less food anytime soon.
Right. Thanks, Miles. And then moving, since you mentioned fires there, there's a question for Katya. And if you could explain, Katya, a little more the relationship between what you're seeing in the increase in annual deforestation rate and for the conditions for the occurrence of fires.
Right. So we are seeing, in terms of variability, the dry season, it has been documented, has become longer. And because of that, we see a longer fire season. And in the feedback, you have a fire season that is longer, you have more edge of the forest that might burn in one certain year. The next year, the fires that occur will come into the forest, deeper into the forest. So it's a feedback process. And the fact that temperatures are also increasing, you have an atmosphere that is drier, evaporation is happening faster, the vegetation stresses faster, and the fires keep occurring repeatedly. So it is a combination of factors that do not seem to be going in a positive direction.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, there are a lot of questions out there about some examples of where governments have been using this information, and they've gone and they're moving forward with the information that's been developed. So, Catherine, I'd like to throw a question to you. And out of all of that incredible information that you were able to show in those data sets, what have you been seeing in terms of the use that governments have made of these data sets for their own climate goals and efforts there for climate in their own countries?
I think there's definitely a great opportunity in terms of what can be done and how the data can be used systematically. But I think even with some of the examples that I've shown, some things work really well, in the context of a project, if funding has been dedicated to that particular task. For example, early warning for early action, and within that frame of the timeline of an activity or a project, it works really, really well. But keeping things consistent over a long-term period, I think, is where things lack, and continuing to evolve the system so they can adopt new data or new methods and become more efficient. Sometimes an institution adopts one system, and transferring or migrating to a more efficient one can be very complicated. And so I think there are lots of examples of the utility and the possibilities, but within a government frame, this funding or structure that is required to continue it is not something that I've seen largely in the places where I work. But there are there's huge interest and investments going that way. It's just, in my opinion, not sufficient or at the level that it should be. And there's a huge dependency or short time frame. So we're not thinking about the longer term things that might unfold. We're dealing with the things that are unfolding really, really rapidly right now. And so we're always unprepared as things continue to escalate in terms of impact. So that's where I sort of see a challenge. And from the research perspective, people are doing incredible work, but it's not transitioning well enough into application and integration and adoption.
Do you think what do you think the answer there is at the end? You gave a little bit of that answer.
I feel like it's intentional. It has to be intentional. It has to be intentional that this is what we want to do, and we're going to do it over the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years consistently. And then we will be able to learn consistently what is unfolding, rather than in the next 3 years, we have this activity. So one of the examples that I showed, that project where, 11 million has been documented by the World Bank as the savings, it was planned and done within a 5-year time frame, but there is no direct follow-on to that. And so the capacity, the interest, the motivation, all of that, sort of just dies with that. And then a whole new one will have to be designed. And so there's no continuity. And so this is, I feel like, intentional long-term thinking about like things as they will unfold 10, 30, 40 years is really important, rather than, so we think that way in policies, but in terms of implementation, it's 3-5 year activities, which is, I think, unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, I want to pass kind of a similar question to you in terms of GeoGlows. What have you seen from the use of this tool? First, there's a real specific question about the number of countries that are covered. I thought I had heard there that this might be covering every single country. So a question to clarify that. But the question is, how are countries actually? Do you have some examples of where some countries are actually have been using this information? It seems like almost every day we're seeing flooding somewhere in the world, and people, the planning hasn't been done. But this seems like an incredible tool for being able to help that. So do you have any examples of where the GeoGlow tool has actually supported governments they've actually moved forward in some of the things that they're seeing from the information that's being provided? Oops, you might be on mute.
Sure, I need to turn my mic on here. Sorry about that.
No worries.
No, there's several countries. It's really hard to tell. I probably could have put up a map. We probably have about 50,000 requests per month since we've been tracking on the metrics the last 6 or 8 months. A lot of that's repeat people that are doing it daily. It's used all over India, we notice. It's been used up in the Ukraine and in that region of the world. We're not quite sure who. The fact that it's a service and allows people to access it means it's open to anybody. We've been working specifically through our Segura Amazonia project with the hydrometeorological services in Peru, Ecuador, in Colombia, and also the Disaster Management Agency in Brazil. And so we're training them how to use it. One of the difficult things about using this information for anybody is there's a lot of uncertainty, and as scientists sometimes we're risk averse to publish our data knowing it's imperfect, and yet at the same time this kind of information, I mean any information in many of these locations is really valuable. The forecast is used directly in a flood warning system in Malawi. There's a group in Israel that has put it together to use in Israel and on the Gaza Strip where they don't even have government really organizations to manage it. And so that has made it very useful, even though there might be better systems and better ways in other places, but making the information available is also improving it. I think that's another important part, is that feedback that we get from local agencies really helps us to be able to improve it.
Yeah, just a follow-on question. This is more of a private sector question there. So as we're seeing, at least here in the United States and parts of Western Europe, insurers are not insuring areas that are so flood prone, and it's really hard for people to predict where. Are you noticing any government use or industry use of this information? Because it seems it would be critical for just the insurance and reinsurance industry.
Yeah, the insurance and reinsurance industry is very interested, and we have different partnerships with some of them in order to make that happen. And so, I mean, the insurance industry, fortunately, is a lot more comfortable working with uncertainty and probabilities, and so that in some ways that makes it easier. The government's always not as much, and it makes it more difficult that it's very difficult for them to be able to deal with the uncertainty that comes with a probabilistic forecast like this. And so helping them understand and learn how to do that has been an important part of our project.
Yeah, great, thanks. Another question I want to throw to Laura. So with the JEDI mission, I know that there's a bunch of people in Amazon conservation who are hoping that the JEDI mission continues. We've been using that, and I'm sure we're not the only ones. Laura, could you say a little bit more about what hoping that things go well, what a continued JEDI mission, what information it may be providing in the future?
Yeah, I actually can finally speak about this a little bit, because I wasn't able to before, but there was just a news article a couple of days ago on NBC. So the potential plan is that JEDI would be taken out of its current spot on the ISS and put kind of in storage, which essentially is like plugging it in somewhere where it can't really operate properly, while another mission whose turn it is to use the JEDI slot does its whole mission for about 18 months. And then JEDI would be put back in its slot and turned back on. And so if the lasers and everything turn on properly, and if this all gets approved by NASA, then JEDI could continue operating without any future competition for that slot, which might mean that it could be operating all the way until 2029, 2030, when the lasers are projected to die. So this, if it all, and there's some big ifs here, right? Like it needs to be approved by NASA, and it needs to turn back on when they turn it back on. But it would mean that we can transition into doing actual change mapping, which is really, really exciting, because JEDI was designed to essentially take like a 2020 snapshot of the forest in 3D, like how much carbon is where in 2020, and then a future mission would start doing the change thing, or we can do fusion with some of the monitoring sensors. So having a time series of JEDI that lasts a whole decade would allow us to do actual like active change monitoring, which of course is extremely useful for things like the Amazon, and to assign those carbon numbers to the forest losses that we're seeing from deforestation and degradation. So that's the hopeful plan.
Right. Well,
Fingers crossed.
We'll be calling our congressman.
Please.
So. Well, great. I'm being prodded here because we're coming to the end of time, and I appreciate the presentations by everybody and the great questions and answers there. But we will maybe be able to answer some questions offline in the future. So moving to our close right now, I want to pass off some closing remarks to Adrian Forsyth. Adrian is the co-founder of Conservación Amazónica, or Amazon Conservation. He has a doctorate from Harvard in tropical ecology and 30 years of experience in the conservation of the region. He has served as Director of Biodiversity Sciences at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, as well as Vice President of Conservation, Vice President at Conservation International. So Adrian, we're glad to have you with us. And if you could give us a few closing thoughts there.
Thank you, Jim. So listening to these amazing presentations and the intelligence of the speakers and the power of the sensors that are being developed, the AI tools, the software, and this collective ability to look into the future is a powerful thing. But it creates in me and perhaps in others this feeling of cognitive dissonance, that strange feeling that you have when your brain is holding one cluster of thoughts and experiences that is in contradiction to another cluster of thoughts and experiences. So while we can understand what's happening to the Amazon and to the planet at much greater detail, resolution, and project it into the future, we see the environmental indicators, the pattern of deforestation, the amount of fire, the change in land use is all going in the other direction. It's not getting better, it's getting worse, in spite of the power of the science that is being brought to bear, in spite of the technology that's being brought to bear. And this suggests a few things. One is it is perhaps being expressed by young people. If you have children who are following this, you realize that a lot of them don't believe that more knowledge, better science will lead to changes in public policy and legislation. And they're throwing tomato soup on paintings of Van Gogh and gluing themselves to the walls of museums in frustration and disbelief that the path that we're on is going to change. So I think what this has to translate into is that the people who do a job of conveying science to policymakers, not just in various levels of government, but in industry and in civil society, there needs to be a much greater investment in that sector because the science isn't really getting through in the time frame that the change is taking place. For example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has had the input of hundreds and hundreds of scientists, is 34 years old. And in that time frame, greenhouse gas emissions have gone steadily upwards. So there needs to be something that will accelerate the pace at which the work that we heard about today is actually transformed into public policy and legislation. And I don't know what that is, but there are people who specialize in that field, and we need a whole lot more of them if the science is actually going to do its job. On the other hand, I was thinking about Catherine's remarks about taking the long-term view. And if you look at the record of greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 in the atmosphere over time, without that long-term baseline and trend, we wouldn't have anything to talk about. And that these baselines and longitudinal measurements really have to be looked at the building of the historical intelligence of civilization. And that without historical intelligence, we will never become smart enough to sustain the planet. So I think the science has to continue no matter whether it's effectively changing how things are done at the highest level politically. The other thing I think we should think about is that something that Miles said, that a forest isn't just trees and an Amazonian river or wetland isn't just water. It's actually a very complex ecosystem anywhere you put your foot or your finger. And we don't know who lives there. We don't know the species that live there, except for, you know, a few vertebrates, birds, frogs, mammals that represent, you know, less than a fraction of a % of total biodiversity. So we actually have to now invest comparably to what we've seen, the amazing remote sensing stuff today, in the inside of the forest, in the inside of aquatic systems, and actually figure out who lives there and how they interact and how they make those systems work. Because what will happen in the long term, I believe we'll hit the tipping point. Everything points towards hitting the tipping point, not just in the Amazon, but in many ecosystems. They will be pushed into very damaged states. And if we achieve this collective intelligence, what we'll have to do is rebuild and restore the planet. And if we don't know what a healthy planet is, we won't know what we're trying to rebuild or restore. So I think we now have to spend a comparable effort in learning what constitutes a healthy Amazonian ecosystem. And that, I hope, will be the subject of a lot of technological investment, especially in genomics and the symbiomics that allows. So those are a few of my thoughts. Amazing stuff. We've got to keep doing it, whether we are going to stop the tipping point or not. The science information that's here is a gift to the long-term future of civilization.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Great, great words of wisdom there and thoughts. We appreciate that. We have one last point in our meeting today, and I'd like to now pass the mic on to Enrique Ortiz. He'll be making a final summation of the event through the use of an infographic, which we'll explain in a moment. But Enrique is the president and co-founder of Conservación Amazónica. He and Adrian together founded Conservación Amazónica, and he's the senior program director of the Andes Amazon Fund. He's a Peruvian ecologist. He studied at the University of San Marcos in Peru and Princeton University here in the United States. He's known for his work in research and conservation of biological diversity in Peru and the Andean Amazon region in general. And also, he's well known, and you read some of his stuff every once in a while, and through his contributions in media in the region. He's worked for some major groups, including Conservation International, Wildlife Conservation Society, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Blue Moon Fund, and he's a former member of the Peruvian National Park Service Board of Directors. So Enrique will do a sum up for us using an infographic, which has basically been developed through this through the meeting today, which kind of shows a summary of some key messages. So I'll pass it off to you, Enrique.
Thank you, John. I have only 4 minutes to do this, which is an impossible task.
You can do it.
But let me tell you first that, you know, I think all these presentations should make us optimistic more than pessimistic, and I think we are all working in that direction. I apologize for actually not being here earlier, but I just came from the field where just after the pandemic, I'm trying to get back into understanding what is actually happening on the ground. So I spent the last few days hanging out with miners and loggers very deep in the Amazon, and that kind of fits all my perceptions. So let me start with infographics. And before everything, I was actually trying to understand or translate the word infographics, and I've been corrected that the right translation is graphic recording, which is what we are seeing. And the point is not really to so much to do a summary, but it's more about highlighting what are the key messages that have been presented during this hour and a half. And before I start that, I must say I love this in graphic recording because everybody looks so pretty and so young, you know, so we should keep doing this. Anyway, Marilena started the presentations with first an introduction of what is the platform and what is Amazon Tech. And not many people actually understand that the purpose of this is a place where it's a platform that has the purpose to share, to also connect and also convene, but also how to demonstrate how monitoring technologies are helping us to control, prevent, and take the right policy actions in order to achieve our objective of protecting the Amazon. Now, following Einar Telnes gave us a pretty optimistic, I would say, and centered opinion, or no opinion, but presentation or words, highlighting the importance of knowledge, and how the importance of sharing knowledge is for our efforts for preserving the forests, and of course our efforts to prevent or stopping global warming. I could go actually with much more detail for each of them, but as is clear, I don't have the time for that. Listening to Miles is always a pleasure. I'm always surprised at how Miles is able to concentrate thoughts and also an optimistic approach to things. So he said so much. It was very hard for the team that is collecting the information to summarize, because there are so many messages that Miles is giving us. But at the same time, it's also giving us a warning of what is happening and where things are going. Understanding what the Amazon is, as Adrian well said it is very critical. No, it is not just a combination of trees and animals, or plants and animals, but it's also a system that is fragile, but at the same time is resilient. And the threat that is under these times is one that is going to affect society in a big way. The carbon sequestration, the value of the forest to prevent climate change is, it's just it's well stated in Miles' presentation. Following Miles, there was Laura Dukinson, who gave us an idea also on how these technologies that, by the way, the name Jedi, is right on, right? I mean, it looks like science fiction, but it is actually quite amazing that all these laser systems, three-dimensional laser systems that are showing us how to, what are the scenarios in the Amazon in terms of climate change and the capacity of the forest to sink, or to control, basically keep the biomass and carbon on the floor or underground, based on this quite sophisticated satellite technology that NASA is working on. And of course, we are all joining the request to hope that this season doesn't get decommissioned. As Maria Elena said, may the forest be with you. The next person, of course, was Catherine. Catherine gave us a very, very interesting presentation, which actually I want to highlight the fact that we have to put in the equation the fact that agriculture is also a major factor in climate change, and we should never decouple the food production part with conservation. And Catherine said it very, very clearly, how these tools they are developing and are using are helping us to make agriculture is more climate resilient. So important, I cannot go on just to highlight how much we have to think about, not only about the nature and the forest, but it's also people need food, and we need to do it better. Well, continuing, and again, being limited by time, Jim Nelson also gave us a pretty important point regarding the part of flooding and the impacts of these disasters, who are called natural disasters, but when you think about it, they are not so natural. They are actually in big way man-made. I just want to put forward that Jim's work is showing how hydrological modeling can also help us to predict where and when, how much water we have, but also where and when human disasters are occurring. Just as an outside point, I was talking with one specialist from Brazil who was telling me that in the case of Acre, Brazil, for example, in Brazil, in the eastern side of Brazil, bordering Peru and Bolivia, in some years, something in the order of 70% of their budget goes into human relief. So if you think about it, how these funds could be used actually in preventing all these disasters, and that's something that the technology that Jean is showing us is a major tool that we have to actually keep increasing, especially in the face of climate change. And finally, well, not finally, Katia was afterwards talking to us about also how the detection and also prevention of fires are happening in the world and in the Amazon in particular. I was in Bolivia 2 weeks ago, and before that in Peru, and our plane almost didn't land because there was so much smoke in the air. And this is just one of the small parts because everybody was coughing, and actually I got also like a sore throat in a matter of hours. Fires in the Amazon are a major factor, and thanks to this the geospatial information that this monitoring is giving us, we can actually predict based on models how where fires may or could be activated. We have to add also to this set of technological tools the fact that policies also are extremely very closely related also to where fires occur and how do we deal with them. And finally, Adrian is always it's always hard to speak after Adrian. I must say I've been in that situation many times. But Adrian is giving us, in spite of the fact that he says that everything is getting worse, in spite of everything that we do, I think it's an optimistic, I guess, mixture of words. Adrian is an optimistic person. I am the pessimistic. So when Adrian says something optimistic, I have to say something pessimistic. It's always the yin and yang. But what Adrian is talking about, that understanding the Amazon is so important, and also the connection that we have to put the Amazon science and conservation efforts and how society responds to that is a critical one. We are, again, I want to just highlight the positive side of things, but also we need to understand how we can influence the public policies. And also, Adrian as a scientist is also highlighting the fact that information gathering and historical information gathering is also a critical factor. So anyway, I didn't want to just be reading the infographics because they are right on, but I just wanted to add a few more, and we can always go back to these, to the graphics. And thank you all for being here, and I will give it back to you, John. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Enrique. Thanks for doing that summation on that infographic. That literally the ink is still wet because it was being developed as we all spoke today. So thank you so much, Enrique, for the closing for us. So there's nothing left to say except for on behalf of Amazon Conservation, I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us today. Miles, Laura, Catherine, Jim, and Katia, and Adrian and Enrique. We're very grateful for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us today. We also want to thank everybody who participated out there in the audience today. We appreciate the questions. We appreciate your interest in this theme and for being here to listen to this today. I also want to thank the ACCA team, especially, who's been working very hard behind the scenes, not only for this session of Amazon Tech, but for the previous one and the one that's coming up next week. So we're so grateful for them actually making all of this possible. So speaking of next week, before you go, we want to invite you to join us virtually on October 27 at 5 p.m. for the final, third and final session of Amazon Tech, which is called Visión Común Amazonia al 2050. It's a common vision for the Amazon for 2050. This session will be in Spanish. And some of the key participants there will include Jose Marengo from IPCC and the Science Panel for the Amazon, Matt Feiner, who's the creator of Amazon Conservation's MOP program, and some of the information you might have seen today. And he's also a member of the Science Panel for the Amazon. So thank you again to everyone who participated today in this, and we look forward to seeing you next week in session 3. Take care, everyone.